New indications that Israel's response to an Iranian missile attack will happen sooner rather than later. Sources are telling CNN American officials expect that retaliation to happen before the U.S. election. That's less than 3 weeks away. We're also hearing from a source that Israeli officials have their plan of attack ready, although Israel has not confirmed that. Meanwhile, Israel's military has resumed attacks on Hezbollah positions in Lebanon after a multi-day pause. One of those strikes killing the mayor of a southern Lebanese city. CNN's Jeremy Diamond is following all of this for us from Jerusalem. So, Jeremy, can you just bring us up to date with these new strikes on Beirut and southern Lebanon? What do we know?
Well, we are seeing that the Israeli military is continuing to relentlessly pound Lebanon with airstrikes. As they say, they are going after Hezbollah targets. But of course, as we have seen over the course of the last couple of months, in particular, as Israeli airstrikes have intensified, we are seeing a cost for civilians. And one strike in particular today happened in the southern Lebanese town of Nabatea. 6 people were killed. 43 others at least have been injured so far in this strike, which actually hit a municipality building and the building housing government administration, according to the Lebanese civil defense. One of the 6 people who were killed was actually this city's mayor. The Israeli military, for its part, says that it was targeting Hezbollah targets in the city to dismantle what they claimed was underground infrastructure used by Hezbollah's elite Radwan force. They also are accusing Hezbollah of using civilians as human shields by having that underground facility beneath homes and civilian buildings in the city of Nabatea. But the results are clear, and that is that civil defense workers are still very much picking through the rubble to determine exactly how many people have been killed, but clearly civilians are among the casualties in this strike.
And Jeremy, I mean, on another front here, I guess, but also related, sources are saying that Israel's response to Iran is ready. Of course, that response came for strikes led by Iran that came a little bit more than a week ago now. Have we heard anything from Israel on that front at all?
Well, nothing official. What we do know is that there have been some really intense conversations between the United States and Israel over exactly, the scope and the targets that Israel will hit in the retaliation that it has vowed to carry out for that barrage of some 200 ballistic missiles. We have heard President Biden very publicly warning Israel not to target Iranian nuclear facilities, also clearly opposed to strikes on oil facilities. Yesterday, we learned, of course, that Israel had privately agreed not to hit those facilities and instead to go after military targets. And now we're being told by a source familiar that Israel's response to Iran is indeed ready, but the timing is still somewhat unclear. The closest that we've been able to get so far from U.S. officials is that it will come before the elections in the United States at the beginning of November, before the presidential election. And that, of course, raises enormous questions about the extent to which these tensions in the Middle East and potentially another round of escalation between Iran and Israel, how that will factor into the presidential election. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, make no mistake, he is very aware of that timing. He is certainly somebody who follows U.S. politics very, very closely and knows very well that the actions that he will take in the coming weeks could have ramifications in the U.S. The question is exactly how it will actually influence the elections, and that is hard to say right now until we see exactly what these strikes look like and what kind of retaliation it draws from Iran. Omar.
Of course. We will see Jeremy Diamond in Jerusalem. Thank you so much. The Israeli government is reportedly reviewing a letter from the Biden administration demanding it improve humanitarian conditions in Gaza within the next 30 days or risk violating U.S. laws governing foreign military assistance, which suggests potential risk to U.S. military aid. That is as Israel's military presses on with a fierce offensive in northern Gaza. The IDF saying today it killed a Hamas commander who led drone operations there, along with dozens more Hamas militants just in the past day. An American surgeon working in southern Gaza tells CNN conditions for civilians across the enclave are getting exponentially worse.
Well, I can tell you what I've seen in 48 hours. And in 48 hours, I've seen children coming in with meningitis, 140 kids in this pediatric unit when there's only 40 beds, They don't have the appropriate antibiotics. They don't have the appropriate treatment. These are just medical conditions. I'm not even talking about the trauma. We have patients coming in who've been untreated for diabetes, which is a very easily treatable disease, who haven't been treated for an entire year because they haven't had access to medications, to hygiene, to the actual medical care, because it's all been destroyed. And in the last 48 hours, I've seen so many patients with wound infections on their feet that have gotten so bad, necrotic, gangrenous, that they've had to have limb amputations. I've done more leg amputations for diabetes than for trauma in the last 48 hours. And so all these things are starting to catch up, and just at an exponential pace, everything is going downhill.
According to reports, Israel says it is reviewing fresh demands from the Biden administration that it take immediate steps to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza or risk violating U.S. law. Over the weekend, the U.S. gave Israel 30 days to meet its demands, including dramatically increasing the number of aid trucks allowed into the territory. If Israel doesn't comply, it could risk violating U.S. laws on foreign military assistance, which could in turn jeopardize U.S. military support in Israel. Humanitarian assistance reaching Palestinians in Gaza has fallen by over 50% since its peak, according to the U.S. State Department. And last hour, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations was asked about the situation on the ground.
The problem in Gaza is not lack of aid. The problem is Hamas, which hijacks the aid, stealing, storing, and selling it to feed their terror machine while civilians suffer. Despite all these challenges, Israel continues to uphold international law, going above and beyond our obligations.
Oren Lieberman is at the Pentagon for us. So, Oren, can you just run us through what's at stake here? I mean, what are the likely consequences if Israel doesn't comply with the Biden administration's demands?
What the consequences could be is very stark for Israel. The U.S. is the most significant, by far, arms supplier to Israel, providing billions in aid a year. And certainly that number has gone up since the beginning of the conflict 1 year ago. So the administration here, in this letter from Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and Secretary of State Antony Blinken, making it quite clear they demand to see, the U.S. that is demands to see improvements in the humanitarian aid going into Gaza, at least 350 trucks a day going through the 4 major crossings, as well as the opening of a 5th crossing, and more aid on top of that. Improvements that the U.S. wants to see within 30 days here. The U.S. says this is part of what is required by law. That is a continuous review and a assessment of whether those receiving U.S. military assistance are abiding by U.S. law regarding that assistance, as well as international humanitarian law. Clearly, the administration has repeatedly and quite loudly said Israel isn't doing enough for the humanitarian situation. They're not buying the argument you just heard put forward there by Israel's ambassador to the UN, an argument Israel has tried to make repeatedly. At stake is that the arms supplied to Israel could be restricted. We have seen one shipment of 2,000-pound bombs paused. That's been paused for months and remains paused. But the threat, the warning here on the table, is that the list of weapons supplied to Israel, the list of restrictions on those weapons could grow if more isn't done, and fairly quickly here, within 30 days. That's the warning given to Israel here. That being said, the U.S. also just sent in a THAAD anti-ballistic missile defense system. So the defensive weapons, those are not the question. The question is, at least from what we see here, is the offensive weapons that Israel has used to carry out its bombardment of Gaza and now its strikes in Lebanon.
And I guess on that latter point, I mean, we have seen points where clearly Israel has been in disagreement with the United States, at least at a leadership level, over how to proceed militarily. And the U.S. has made demands like this or in this nature before, but then has also continued to supply Israel with weapons and other military support, some of which defensive, as you just mentioned. So is this letter any different from what we've seen previously in this war?
That's an excellent question. This letter is certainly a more significant step than we have seen the administration take to this point. So perhaps that signals a change in thinking here, and there will be more political will to restrict arms to Israel, because we haven't really seen that in the past. Even with the warnings on the humanitarian aid situation, all that's been held is this shipment of 2,000-pound bombs. So it is therefore then a question of political will. It's worth noting that the 30 days that the U.S. has given Israel here to fix this problem is after, that deadline is after the U.S. election. Is there more political will after the election? That's the true question here. And that's what we will have to wait to see here, because you're absolutely right to point out that despite these repeated warnings and very public warnings and open warnings in the past, the U.S. hasn't really restricted the supply of weapons to Israel in any significant way.
And you do bring up a good point that after the U.S. election, the posturing either from, or at least the perception of what the future of the United States foreign policy is could shift dramatically depending on who's elected there. Oren Liebermann at the Pentagon, really appreciate it.